Have you ever thought about how you would go about adapting your favourite video game series into a film? Of course you have. Everyone has. And what better way is there to act on these natural, idle fantasies than to participate in an ongoing series where a collection of YouTube creators subject their audiences to their previously private, juvenile and unfulfilled daydreams? Because that's exactly what I'm about to do. With a bottle of Jägermeister in one hand and a can of Red Bull in the other, I've cornered you in the metaphorical hallway of this digital house party and will now breathlessly rant at you about how my idea of a Thief video game movie would work and why it'd be totally awesome. As a side note, Spoilerfink and other YouTubers have made similar collaborating videos to this one using other video games as inspiration. They've just made theirs presumably with more charm, flair and wit than mine, so feel free to check them out in the description once you're done here and want some content that is actually good. Until then, enjoy! As I have discussed here on this channel before, the Thief series is a classic in the stealth genre and widely praised for its moody ambience, immersive world building, and all-round brilliant gameplay. And since video game-based films are usually objectively terrible, the task has fallen to me to explain how I'd go about turning the Thief franchise into a passable film that could be both watchable and faithful to the series. So to begin, there are two obvious hurdles that I can see coming. The first is that the game's protagonist, Garrett, is difficult to show on screen without spoiling his core appeal. Garrett gets much of his allure from being mysterious, and in the first 3 games of the series, great care is given to never show too much of him. This is a problem for our film, as it means the camera needs something outside of the actions of our protagonist to film. The second is that good stealth isn't actually all that fun to watch. Stealth, when successful, often makes for rather unclimactic storytelling. A sneaky or devious heist can be tense to experience even when pulled off flawlessly, but ultimately a film about a man who expertly ghosts his way past several guards without difficulty and completely avoids setting off any of the alarms, which is the kind of master thief that Garrett is painted as, is a story where the protagonist almost encounters conflict, but then doesn't. This renders the story flat and it deprives it of tension and conflict. Granted, you do get engaging and thrilling heist films, like The Great Escape, Ocean's 11, or Lock, Stock and Two Smoked Sausages, but even in heist films, some kind of spanner is generally thrown into the works to make things go wrong, or at least seem to go wrong. People get caught in The Great Escape, robbers forget to case the joint properly and end up in an armed standoff in Lock, Stock. You get the drift. Unfortunately for us, Garrett is the greatest thief the world has never seen, so you can't really use the character of Garrett and then introduce conflict by having him blunder into an alarm system or just get caught halfway through scaling a particularly tricky fence.
No, you didn't hear from it.
I think we do.
I think we do.
Oh, come on, please.
Head on.
Please.
Yeah, we got it.
How long's he been here?
How long you been there?
20 minutes.
So since the heist genre of films won't work as a model for a Thief movie, I propose instead that we double down on how awesome Garrett is and reinvent him for a new audience. We could play up his totally awesome wicked ninja skills. The movie could be filled with high-octane chase sequences, choreographed fight scenes, explosions, and stealth takedowns. We could have him chased by dogs across a rooftop while he gets shot at and has to do park. We could make Garrett a ninja. Doing fight scenes. Jumping down from raft. His bow's like a sniper rifle. Seriously though, can you imagine how shit that would be? So when deciding on a genre to code the film, it might be worth looking at what had worked narratively in the past for these games. Both the Metal Age and Deadly Shadows function as conspiratorial mystery stories, whereas the earlier game had Garrett going on fantasy horror adventures and the reboot just had him doing fucking cartoon hero ninja bullshit. Thief 2 and 3 were really private detective stories with a looming apocalyptic bent. Most of the levels in 2 and 3 involve acquiring clues more than nabbing loot, so I propose that a Thief film would work best as an analogue of a detective story. This would allow us to create tension through focusing our plot on getting to the bottom of a conspiracy, and would give the film something bigger to occupy its characters' time with than just, I must protect the loot, I must steal the loot. Of course, now that we have settled on a genre and clarified the two main pitfalls that we should aim to avoid, it's worth talking about the setting of the film. The Thief world has steampunk elements, but is largely time period ambivalent. It has bank vaults with automated security cameras and roaming mechs, but the feudal system still seems to be perfectly intact, and almost all the guards still carry swords. What's more, there is some inconsistency between the games themselves. The architecture, art, and clothing of Thief the Dark Project appears medieval, whereas the reboot is more Victorian. Thief 2 is early industrial, even though its interiors can seem more modern, but again the city's social system gives off strong Renaissance-era vibes. What is certain is that a modern setting wouldn't work. Banks these days don't hold that much cash, and outwitting their security systems requires a lot more planning and tech than a typical thief heist would allow for. Plus, most people's assets are digital nowadays, so a thief set in the modern day would inevitably end up looking like Watch Dogs, which is really not what we want aesthetically or otherwise. Personally, I think it would be interesting if the film was set in a vaguely steampunkish Edwardian setting. Alarm systems exist in a very rudimentary form, as do guns, but the average night watchman mostly carries a truncheon, and importantly for the sake of stealth, people still keep their valuables in safes, with the majority of policemen patrolling by foot. Now, Garrett's character would still work as a thief, but I would make the case that he would be best used as an almost secondary protagonist for the story. As I said, a thief film would always have to contend with the tension that exists between wanting to have Garrett as a protagonist and having to avoid revealing too much about him. So I would say that the film should ideally be split between the perspective of a private detective who is on Garrett's tail and the actions of Garrett himself. Perhaps with much of Garrett's actual screen time being reserved for the last fifth of the movie. There is perhaps a temptation to film Garrett performing stealthy infiltration sequences that look like something out of a Splinter Cell game, with Garrett performing death-defying acts of bravery to circumvent security systems, or perhaps film him silently gliding around the set like an assassin in an Ang Lee movie. But the sneakiness of cutscene Garrett is best shown rather than oh wait, no, that show don't tell thing doesn't apply so much here. Look, in cutscenes in the game, Garrett just vanishes, and I think that any serious thief film should try to hold on to this. Keeping Garrett away from the main storyline lets us marvel at the aftermath of his heists and be baffled by his almost supernatural ability to escape the detective. Of course, the film can, and probably should, eventually reveal some of the ways that Garrett has been sneaking around without being caught, but the emphasis should be on how Garrett's professional experience and well-honed judgment helps him predict and outmaneuver guards and pursuers. After all, that is what stealth in the Thief games actually consists of. Good timing, careful observation of the environment, and well-honed judgment. So these elements of stealth should naturally be brought to the front when revealing how Garrett manages to be so sneaky, and conversely, these scenes should ideally avoid fetishizing just how much of a supposed ninja he is. For example, we open on a shipping yard on a rainy night. Two watch officers are chatting and they reveal that they are guarding a warehouse containing a rare shipment of gems. Moments later, one of the guards walks off-screen. The audience and remaining guard hear an off-screen splash of someone falling, or being dumped, into the water. The remaining guard calls out, can't find his friend, and then through the darkness gets hit with a crossbow bolt to the throat. The guard gurgles and flails about, bleeding in the dark, as a hooded figure emerges from the shadows, takes a key off the dying guard's belt, and enters the warehouse. Now, I know what you're thinking. Hold up. Garrett doesn't kill. To which I say, yes he fucking does. And it's good to have him kill here for the brief time that he's on screen, because it helps establish him as an actual anti-hero and not a goody two-shoes Batman surrogate who bizarrely will happily bankrupt the impoverished citizens of a dying city, yet for some reason clutches his own pearls at the thought of killing one of the hundreds of crossbow-wielding psychopaths who have been paid to shoot him on sight. Anyway, I digress. Garrett kills people when he needs to, and that's okay. Our next scene is the detective investigating the dockside warehouse. Maybe he is a Hammerite, maybe it's a reference to Inspector Drept. Doesn't matter, these are just options. Since the detective thinks he knows where Garrett will strike next, he then warns the head of security of some jewellery museum, who ignores him and brags about how impenetrable his security is. And so we cue humorous cut to the head of security standing in the lobby of the museum the next morning, jaw agape, alarm ringing to no effect, half the cabinets emptied of their contents, and the night watchman face down on the floor unconscious. At this point, we raise the stakes as the detective notes that only certain items have been taken, items with perhaps a similar theme or origin, and the detective privately deduces that some sort of magical conspiracy is taking place, and Garrett has been hired to unwittingly acquire the necessary artifacts for some kind of magical apocalyptical ceremony. Much like Garrett was tricked in Thief the Dark Project into retrieving a magical gem to help a malevolent trickster god take over the city. Perhaps this apocalypse could involve zombies. I know that the fantasy heavy levels were the worst part of the first Thief game, but horror has always played a role in the franchise, and in particular I'm intrigued by the mythology of the Old Quarter, a section of the city walled off due to a zombie epidemic. So while we are playing with the possibility of an apocalypse, a unit of halberdiers having to crowd control a horde of freshly risen zombies would be very interesting to watch. So the detective is now pursuing Garrett, partly to catch him and recover the artifacts, and failing that, inform him of what his employer is planning to do with the items Garrett has been stealing. Of course, the detective will eventually get a hold of Garrett and help convince him that he's being had, only to discover that the artifact had already been handed over, and the climax of the film could involve the two of them hatching a plan together to foil Garrett's previous employer, one that requires the detective to sacrifice themselves as a distraction so that Garrett can quietly save the world. So that's it. That's how I'd make a totally awesome film about the Thief games. It'd be set in an ahistorical era of steampunk yore and take the form of a detective film where much of the intrigue and action was to be found in tracking down the elusive Garrett, who then ends up being forced into the role of anti-hero and saving the world. Any questions? No? Good. Now go watch the other videos in this series.